Picture every country in Western Europe: France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, combined into a single state. Now put a West African Muslim ruler in command of all of it, governing from a city most of the world still couldn't find on a map. That empire was real. It was built in less than 40 years by two men. This is the story of the second one, Askia Muhammad, and the Songhai Empire he pushed to the largest size in African history. He was born Muhammad Touré around 1442, a Soninka boy along the banks of the Niger, in a world where the Mali Empire that had once ruled this stretch of Africa was collapsing under its own weight. He rose the hard way, as a soldier, then a general, under Sani Ali, the ruthless warlord who had spent nearly 30 years tearing Songhai out of Mali's wreckage, conquering Timbuktu and Jenne, and turning a minor river kingdom into a real power by sheer force of will. Sani Ali died in 1492. His son, Sani Baru, inherited the throne and immediately proved he couldn't hold it, refusing to govern by the Islamic law his father's court had come to expect, alienating the merchants, the clerics, the very people whose loyalty an empire this size needed to survive. Muhammad Touré didn't wait for permission. In April of 1493, he met Baru in battle at Enfao, just outside the capital at Gao, and crushed him. He took the throne that day and took a new name with it, Askia. Historians still argue over what it meant: the forceful one to some, the usurper to others. Since he'd taken this crown the only way it was ever going to be his, by force, from another man's son. He didn't waste the throne he'd seized. Sani Ali had built Songhai through sheer conquest, running it more like an armed camp collecting tribute than a governed state. Askia went further, drawing on the tradition of sophisticated statecraft that West African empires like Mali had already pioneered generations earlier, and building Songhai's own version of it, larger and more durable than anything the kingdom had run before. He carved Songhai into 5 provinces and put his own appointed governors over every one of them, answerable to him and no one else. He installed ministers over finance, over justice, over agriculture, a functioning bureaucracy running an empire, not a war camp collecting tribute. He built a standing army out of infantry and cavalry, and then went further, building a river navy of war canoes that could move troops and supplies down the Niger faster than any force on the continent could match them. He put trade inspectors in every major market and forced merchants across the empire onto the same standardized weights and measures. He became the first ruler in West African history to formally exchange ambassadors with the Muslim powers of North Africa and the Middle East, putting Songhai, by name, on the same diplomatic footing as empires that had never once had to acknowledge it existed. And from 1498 to 1502, he took that machine to war, pushing outward against the Mossy kingdoms and the peoples of the air, until Songhai's borders ran from the Atlantic coast in the west to what's now Niger in the east, pushing the empire Sani Ali had founded into the largest Africa had ever produced. 2 years into his reign, in 1496, he set out for Mecca. And he didn't travel quietly. Roughly 1,500 soldiers and attendants marched with him across the Sahara, hauling enough gold to announce exactly what kind of empire had sent him. He gave so much of it away in charity along the route, funding a permanent hostel in Medina just for West African pilgrims, that he came home from the wealthiest empire in West Africa 50,000 ducats in debt, and he didn't care. In Mecca, the Sharif himself named him Caliph of the Western Sudan. That title was worth more than the gold. He'd taken his throne by the sword. He came home holding it by faith, by law, and by the recognition of the entire Islamic world. He came home and built accordingly. He appointed Islamic judges across the provinces. He funded mosques. And under his dynasty, the scholarly quarter at Sankore, in the city of Timbuktu, already centuries old by the time he was born, exploded into its golden age. At its peak, its mosque university complex pulled in the range of 25,000 scholars and students into a city of only about 100,000 people. Manuscripts changed hands in the markets for sums that outpaced almost any other commodity. Students debated law, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics under the same roofs where merchants argued over gold and salt. Timbuktu corresponded with Cairo, with Baghdad, with Cordoba, as an equal, not a curiosity. We stood as a full partner in the intellectual world of Islam, not a footnote to it. The tradition Askia fostered there would eventually produce Ahmad Baba, the last chancellor of Sankore and one of the greatest scholars West Africa ever produced. A man whose personal library alone ran into the thousands of volumes. A public library in Timbuktu today still holds over 18,000 manuscripts from that era, and it's named for him. Askia's expansion had a cost beyond the battlefield. His conquests relied on slave raiding. Captives became forced laborers who sustained the imperial bureaucracy, and enslaved soldiers filled the ranks of the same military that kept expanding the empire's borders. This wasn't incidental to Songhai's power. It was part of how that power was built and maintained. It doesn't erase what Askia built. It's part of the full record of what building it required. For 35 years, he ruled the largest empire Africa had ever produced. It didn't end well for him personally. The man who had crushed an heir in battle, who had walked into Mecca at the head of 1,500 soldiers, who had built a functioning government out of a war camp, grew old and went blind, and hid it from his own court for as long as his pride would let him. It wasn't enough. In 1528, his own son, Askia Musa, moved against him and forced him from the throne, exiling him to an island in the middle of the Niger River, the same river his empire had been built along. Later, he was allowed back to live out his final years at the palace in Gao, stripped of every power he'd spent 35 years building, keeping only the title. He died there in 1538, reportedly around 96 years old, the same river, a very different man. For a while after that, the empire held together. Songhai enjoyed decades of relative peace and prosperity under the successors who followed him, and trade kept flourishing in Gao, Timbuktu, and Jenne. It was only later, in the final decades of the 1500s, that fresh succession disputes tore the dynasty apart from the inside. In 1591, with the empire distracted by its own civil war, a Moroccan army armed with muskets crossed the Sahara and shattered what remained of Songhai's forces at the Battle of Tondibi. Gunpowder against cavalry, and cavalry lost. Ahmad Baba himself was deported to Morocco in the occupation that followed. The empire that had once stretched larger than Western Europe fractured into smaller successor states within a generation. None of that erases what stood for those 35 years, an empire larger than the combined territory of Western Europe, cities on the edge of the Sahara, funding one of the great universities of the medieval world, a Black African state standing as a full partner in the intellectual life of the Islamic world, at the exact moment the empires that would later call Africa the Dark Continent hadn't built anything close to it. We built that. History just took its time saying so.